Rules Committee to come to order, and good evening, and thank you for joining us for another fun day at the Rules Committee. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 953, the Reducing Regulatory Burdens Act of 2017. H.R. 953 returns the state of pesticides regulation to the status quo, reflecting a 2006 Environmental Protection Agency rule that was overturned by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in 2009. Under the bill, this safe use of pesticides, which has been regulated for decades, will continue to be regulated under FIFRA, which is known as the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. Did I get that Rodenticide Act right? Okay. FIFRA. Learn something new up here. You know, Jim, I need to sit on the Ag Committee occasionally just to learn these.
I do, and I can't pronounce the word.
Okay. This legislation eliminates what I believe is unnecessary regulatory requirements that impede an effective proactive response, especially at a time when we're trying to fight against the Zika virus and generally combating dangerous mosquitoes. And this certainly, we've been told for several years, is one of the efforts that should be used on offense against Zika. I'd like to welcome the gentleman from Ohio, my dear friend, Congressman Gibbs. He's our first and only witness and only panel today, and I want to thank him for joining us. But before we move on past this, I want to acknowledge we have two new awesome stenographers that are over in the side that are sitting here today. Judge Hastings, you've been around stenographers for many years in your prior life. These are young women who have just now come. They started April, I think, 21st and 25th. They're eager. I had a few minutes with them a few minutes ago and thanked them not only for their service to the committee, but told them we will refer to them as they are awesome. Without objection, anything the gentleman has right to be entered in the record. But before we go any further, the gentleman from Massachusetts ranking member is recognized.
I'll make this as painless as possible and yield my time back and look forward to hearing from the witness.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the gentleman's help. Obviously, the gentleman sits on the Agriculture Committee and has taken part in not only these debates, but the testimony that and the hearing that took place, the markup took place. So, Mr. Gibbs, we're delighted that you're back. Don't know how many times you've been up here, but as we were talking about in the office a few minutes ago, it's been several times. You've done well enough to get invited back every time, and I would assume that's going to happen again. Gentlemen, recognized.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, other members of the committee, for hearing this. And I strongly support H.R. 953, the Reducing Regulatory Burdens Act of 2017. I introduced 953 really to clarify the congressional intent regarding how the use of pesticides in or near navigable waters should be regulated. Like Chairman said, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, also known as FIFRA, is not the Clean Water Act, which has long been the federal regulatory statute that governs the safety of use of pesticide in the United States. And for at least 60 years, this has been the case. And what happened, there was a lawsuit in the Sixth Circuit Court, the National Cotton Councils versus the EPA in 2009, and this court decision overturned 60 years of common sense regulation by the EPA and imposed the Clean Water Act permitting on pesticide use. This case upended the 2016 EPA rule that codified its longstanding interpretation of pesticide application in compliance with FIFRA requirements is not a discharge or a pollutant under the Clean Water Act, and therefore the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permits, is not required. In vacating that rule, the Sixth Circuit legislated from the bench, ignoring the congressional intent as well as reasonable agency interpretations of the law. In the process, the court undermined the traditional understanding of how the Clean Water Act interacts with other federal, state, and environmental statutes and judicially expanded the scope of the Clean Water Act regulation further into areas already regulated. I think that's an important point. Under FIFRA, EPA has full jurisdiction and sets the label, approves the label on every pesticide that's applied, and can also restrict pesticides and put restrictions on who applies these pesticides. In many cases, pesticides have to be applied by trained pesticide applicators that go through an EPA rigorous training and testing. And so I think it's important to remember that the EPA has full control of these pesticides, and they can pull a pesticide off the market at any time if they warrant unsafe, and they have that full scope. And so what happened in this court case, by putting under the Clean Water Act, basically they were saying, the court was saying that the sprayer, the applicator, you know, it could be the sprayer on a tractor, the sprayer on the back of a truck, is point source and falls under the Clean Water Act and have to get MPDS permitting. And this applies to state agencies, cities and counties, mosquito control districts, water districts, obviously pesticide applicators, farmers and ranchers, forest managers, scientists, and everyday citizens. You take all those combined, that's over almost 6 million applications annually. EPA estimated the paperwork burden is approximately $50 million per year, and others estimate the administrative burdens to be even greater. This ill-advised court decision is expending vital funds to initiate and maintain the Clean Water Act permitting programs governing pesticide applications, and public and private pesticide users face increased burdens of financial and administrative costs in order to apply the new permitting process. I think it's also in my Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee of T&I in the past Congress, we had numerous hearings regarding this bill, and it became evident that we had some mosquito control districts that were struggling to get their MPDS permits because of the cost. Sometimes I have examples I can mention, I can reference to that exceeded or nearly exceeded their total budget to get an MPDS permit. And in some instances, I think that's ironic. We all want to do everything we can to protect the environment and protect our water quality in the United States, but what's interesting is if the mosquitoes, let's use this as an example, if we have West Nile virus or Zika outbreak in an area that's so bad, the local mosquito control district or the local municipality, entity, whatever, can declare an emergency. And under emergency status, they don't have to get a permit for anything. And then they can also do aerial spraying. And I think it just makes common sense if you can do surface spraying and avoid aerial spraying, you can better chance of protecting the environment and the health and human health. And so I think it's important to mention that also under the Clean Water Act, the Clean Water Act was set up in 1972 really to be a partnership between the federal government and the states, where the states would implement and enforce the Clean Water Act, but also it had serious penalties, even criminal penalties, to go after the polluters, what I like to say the polluters of the 1960s, and clean that up. And so when you extend the Clean Water Act into this, on top of the FIFRA regulation, you open up farmers, everyday homeowners to all kinds of serious penalties, and also citizens' lawsuits. And we have seen some areas. Well, I got it right here. In Idaho, the Gem County Mosquito Abatement District was forced to spend 10 years and $450,000, which is the district's entire annual budget, to resolve a citizen's lawsuit. The Benton County Mosquito Control District sets aside 20% of its annual budget in case the district is sued in a Clean Water Act-related lawsuit. I certainly don't think that the members of Congress back in 1972 intended the Clean Water Act to go after everyday citizens and farmers, and especially when they're using a product that's already approved under the label from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So we know what we've seen is the possibility of more and more slow walking, especially in the mosquito control areas, districts, because they'll get to the, obviously when you're spraying for mosquitoes, you're spraying in or near water bodies or navigable waters, and it's why it's so important. This bill is important to pass to really even bring really common sense regulation. And let's see, I think I want to thank Chairman Conaway and the Ag Committee and Chairman Schuster and the Transportation Infrastructure Committee for their leadership, and Ranking Member Colin Peterson on the Agriculture Committee for his leadership on this. And it was voted out of the Agricultural Committee by a voice vote. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Mr. Gibb, thank you very much. The committee has
for quite some time been struggling, I think, as the Congress has, as people back home has, as really all of us have, in getting our arms around not only Zika, or not just the mosquito issue, but Zika in particular. And there was a great bit of concern, perhaps hysteria, about the ability that we would have to to identify, to come up with best practices, to understand what is this, whether we were looking at NIH, whether we were looking at individual communities, whether we were looking at the responsibilities of communities to enforce their own mosquito control. And I would say this: you have been up here before and pushing this bill. This, to me, is prudent and proper action. We have some 100 Zika cases that we know of in the United States. Would this become something that the rest of the world could then see how we do this, or is the rest of the world ahead of us and we're now trying to catch up?
Well, Chairman, I think that's a great question. I know my memory serves me when the Zika outbreak started before it hit the United States. It was I think it was Puerto Rico, if I remember right. And
I think it was even south.
Well, it was south, but I think that
we were talking about Brazil.
Yeah, it started in
essentially
Brazil,
because
that's
we
right.
had last year about this time we were getting ready for the Olympics.
Yeah, that's right. And I think they started. My understanding is they started, preventative measures on eradicating mosquitoes, which is of course hard to do. I think where my memory is. A few years ago, we had a serious West Nile outbreak before Zika was around, and we saw the numbers of West Nile mosquito carriers just exponentially explode, and we saw lots of West Nile outbreaks. And then the last 2 years, the Zika was a whole new phenomena, and I think this. Obviously, there's lots of things we can try to do to prevent Zika and West Nile, but I think this is one tool in the toolbox that we need to have. So the EPA and all the mosquito control districts around the country have the ability to start the preventative programs in the early spring and move forward. And like I just reiterate again, it's how important to realize that these pesticides are already under the jurisdiction of the EPA. And they set the label, and what I mean for the non-farmers maybe don't understand that, the label says, is established over lots of research and all that work the EPA does to establish how the product can be used and the application, the rates, the amount of pesticide, and all that's established in the label, all approved by the EPA after a rigorous testing, and it's just like we do and FDA does on pharmaceuticals. So it's similar to that. And so I think it's important to start these programs, because when you start your preventative maintenance programs, you go after the eggs and everything. But if you wait because you couldn't get the necessary permitting, which we know that's happened, and then you have a bigger problem to control. So it's easier to control starting in the beginning of the season than to wait till halfway through the season when there's a serious
avoiding a problem.
Avoiding the problem. And this is just, I think, is just one tool. And this worked fine for at least 60 years under FIFRA. And this is just an added layer from the court decision that, in a court case, you kind of look in tunnel vision, and I think it was just a tunnel vision court case. And it's our responsibility as policymakers to look at this in the broad spectrum and the history, and make it clear. I want to make it clear that these pesticides are regulated, and our EPA has full control to monitor this situation. And like I said earlier, if a pesticide is at a certain level of effectiveness that's maybe has a different degree of hazards, the EPA can put restrictions on who applies those pesticides and under the supervision who's applying those pesticides. And then another thing I noticed in my agricultural background, when applicators, certified applicators are applying a pesticide, they have to record, make a record of the time of day, the wind speed, the humidity, sunlight, temperature, amount of flight, everything, and it's all there for inspection. So if there is a problem that does develop, we don't live in a perfect world, the EPA or whoever can go back and see what happened and then make judgments from that. But we have a very stringent requirement to follow our pesticide applicators of what they're doing and when they're doing it and all that. It's all documented.
Well, I'm delighted that you've taken time not only to be here today, but your really tenacity in avoiding a bigger problem by using common sense. Thank you very much. Chairman Cole.
Thank you. I don't have a lot of questions because I was very much in favor of your bill last year, and I remain very much in favor of it because I think, as the chairman says, it's common sense. It really is. And there's a lot of safeguards here, appropriately so. I'm sorry, honestly, the legislation last year got caught up in the Zika debate, which I think got highly politicized. Yeah. We're fortunate, obviously, we certainly had some cases, and of course, for most people, as long as you're not pregnant, it's not a dangerous thing, but if you are, it can be very, very dangerous, and we were spared a lot of that, and we reacted pretty quickly, but these tools need to be available for emergency situations. So I really appreciate you taking the initiative and coming back now when it's maybe a little cooler climate, and certainly the unanimity through committee, I think, suggests that people, as they've thought this through, think this just makes a lot of sense for the American people. So you're to be commended. So the next time we have something like this, the appropriate tools are available to people, and with, as you point out, plenty of safeguards, but we allow people to respond immediately before something like this gets out of hand. So I want to commend the gentleman for his hard work, and with that, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma, the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, thank you for being here. I'm on the Agriculture Committee, and we had a voice vote, but I voted no. But I'm such a nice guy, I didn't call for a roll call vote. But one of the things that really bothers me is that we're getting farther and farther away from regular order with regard to legislation like this. So we had a markup in the Agriculture Committee, but we didn't have a hearing. And you're on the Transportation Committee, you didn't have a hearing, you didn't even have a markup. And I'm just curious, what's this all, why is that the case? I mean, it's not like the Transportation Committee is working on an infrastructure bill that we all want you to work on. I mean, not even a markup. It just seems like we ought to pay attention to making sure that all the committees, do what they're supposed to do.
Mr. McGovern, Mr. Chair, when I was chairman in the last 3 Congresses of the Subcommittee on Water Resources and Environment of T&I, we did have hearings on this bill. We had hearings on this bill last year, but not this Congress. We had considerable testimony on the impact, and I can, just looking through my notes here, here's one county, Benton County, was forced to spend $37,000 to comply with a redundant federal permit. What happened, and we had Benton County, I don't say what, I think it was out in Idaho or out there, out west somewhere. But my point I'm trying to make is we had these counties or these mosquito control districts come in and testify.
Yeah.
And I know when this was on the House floor last Congress, there was an argument made it only cost $100 to get an MBS permit. That might be the actual filing fee, but it's, as we've seen, it's cost thousands of dollars to get to go through the work to get the information you need to do the permitting and the consultants and all that.
I'm not here to argue the substance. I mean, we're mostly a process committee here. And I guess my only point is that we have 50 new members of Congress in this Congress. They weren't here last time around. And I do think that, if the new standard is going to be, as long as we had a hearing at some point in the past, we don't need to have another hearing on legislation, in any future Congress. So that's a new rule, and you guys are in charge. You can do that. I just don't, but not even a markup. I mean, why wouldn't?
Wait, we had a markup in ag. What do you mean?
No, we had a markup on ag, but you're the, isn't transportation?
They had joint jurisdiction, because Agriculture Committee has jurisdiction on FIFRA, and Transportation Committee has jurisdiction on Clean Water Act.
Yeah, I mean, transportation, you have primary jurisdiction over this bill?
It's questionable.
Well, even if you didn't, I mean, it would seem to me that you do a markup.
It was,
Anyway,
it was included in the Farm Bill, the last Farm Bill, and it was taken out in the Senate.
Anyway, I'm just pointing out something that it's not unique to this legislation, but it's becoming a habit, and I think it's a dangerous trend we're moving down. But anyway, I don't have any further questions. You're back.
Thank you very much. I do take very seriously what the gentleman's saying, and I do recognize also there's responsibility to do your homework. And I don't mean you, I mean committee members. When I sat on committees, I needed to know, even though things we did not do, I do them in this committee, you do them in this committee. But I think the discussion that we do try and do in this committee is that Mr. Gibbs comes up here and really gives substantive data and information about this that is available back in those committees, committees of resources committees. And so I would hope that, other things are different, more complex issues. This is a pretty straightforward issue.
Yeah, well, but if I remember the Transportation Committee, and I was new, I was not able to be part of a hearing, and I wasn't even able to be part of a markup.
Yes.
I think there's a problem with that kind of
Like I said,
process, that's all.
I do hear you, Jim, and you know that especially early in the year, I got that
I hear.
too. So I
appreciate
thank the
that.
gentleman very much. Is there any other member of the committee that would seek time? The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
Very briefly, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to take notice of Mr. McGovern's earlier statement and just make sure that we all stipulate that he is a kind and generous man.
Well,
He
I'll
is-
second that.
He is someone that puts patriotism before party, and we all appreciate having him here, and his bipartisan nature is just overwhelming, so thank you.
It's the first time I've agreed with you in a long time, so thank you.
It's nice. And I appreciate the gentleman. You know, sometimes weekends are good. Sometimes weekends are good. Judge Hastings?
Very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'd just like to put on the record that I voted twice against this measure. And Mr. Gibbs, what augurs well for it is I did have a visit from the American Mosquito Control Association. They were concerned about the votes that I cast, and they were in favor of same. And it's a group that operates out of Florida, and as you might expect, we have ongoing issues with reference to not only mosquitoes, but generally. I've kind of had the lead in Congress for a while about pollinators, and my concern, not on this legislation, but my concern is I run into roadblocks with those that would use the chemicals that will harm the bees, and that's an issue for another day, but I'm fond of saying if we don't have any bees, we won't have any food. So I know the pesticide industry is very much in favor of this particular measure. I also know that the applicants of the process want to get rid of the added regulation. But now this will mark the 6th time that the legislation has been presented. It's the 4th time that I know of that I will have voted on it. Came here last year as something having to do with Zika and the vector, it was called some kind of legislation having to do with Zika. Each time it has passed the House, it has died in the Senate. Not to target any particular senator or senators, but do you know why that is, that it doesn't get past the United States Senate?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hastings, first I want to just respond to your initial comments on pesticide, chemicals general, and use general. My background is agriculture, farming. When one thing I think it's always important to state, that farmers, agricultural people do their best to make sure that the chemicals they're using are used in the proper and safe way to label. And I think the pesticide companies do their best, and testing and the regulators. And the one thing we take for granted in this country is our safe and wholesome food supply we have, and pesticides play a major role in that. And that's why we have so much availability at an affordable price. When you go in the grocery store, you can just think about the next time you go in the grocery store. A lot of that's because of the industry and all our hardworking agriculturalists and all the related people to the agricultural industry. Your second part of your question regarding what happened in the Senate, if you go back, this bill actually passed out of suspension the very first time I had it. I think it was at 294 votes, if I remember, something like that. And then the next time it suspension, it got hung up with a political question that was something different between the majority and the minority, and then it came up, Leader McCarthy put it up under rules, and it passed. It was included in the Farm Bill out of the House. It was pulled out of the Farm Bill in the Senate. There was in particular one senator in the past that I don't know what the reason was, why it was pulled out. Apparently, the rules in the Senate, we don't have those rules in the House where one House member can stop a bill, but apparently they do in the Senate. I don't quite understand that phenomena. But this bill has wide, as you stated, Mr. Hastings, broad support across industry sectors. And I think it's just important to remember that the people out there, the industries that are involved with this, if something goes the wrong way, I'd like to say in agriculture we spend a lot of time building up the bank account of goodwill. And you can have a run on the bank overnight and all that goodwill is gone and all that good public perception. And so to think that there's people out there that want to do the wrong thing, I'm sure there's always a bad apple somewhere, but in general, the majority of the people in this industry want to do the right thing and supply wholesome, safe, affordable food for America and the world for that matter. And that's why it's so important. And then you add on the mosquito issue we've had, unfortunately, with West Nile and Zika. It's a real shame if a local mosquito control district can't get an MBDS permit in time and can't start their preventative program because of the court case and not because we don't pass this bill.
I understand you, and I also understood you to say that you began the legislative process to assist in clarifying the matter, particularly after the court intervention seemed to cause conflict between the two controlling entities. I do want to say to you that there are almost 20 of us here in Congress that represent urban and rural districts. And I have the good fortune of representing the agriculture industry in large part in South Florida. And I do agree with you that they do a remarkable job in trying to meet the standards. But because of ongoing concerns and conflicts with rules and regulations, it is something that we have to be concerned about. But my friends in ag like yours, and I might add, I've never been a farmer, but I worked on a hell of a lot of them in my lifetime, and the best thing I can think about picking beans is it certainly will cause you to want to go to school. So it helped me in that regard. But in any event, I understand where you're coming from, and I appreciate the data that you present, and we'll go forward and see how it works on the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to just respond a little bit. I think if you don't take anything else away from this, just remember that the EPA, we're not taking the control away from EPA. We're just keeping it under what we had for 60-plus years under FIFA law and not the Clean Water Act. And so the Clean Water Act, because of the court case, just made a redundancy of what people have to go through and slow the process down and actually could cause more problems to our human health and water quality. So I think it's always important to remember the EPA still has absolute authority to regulate these pesticides. And
Well, Mr. Gibbs, they may have what you say, but they're going to have much authority after this budget comes out on tomorrow. It does appear, not so much as it pertains to this specific matter, but a third cut in the budget of the EPA is going to have enormous consequences in this nation, and I don't think, as it relates to this matter, it's going to have a harmful effect. But I certainly will be keeping my eyes wide open on the potential consequences for such an enormous cut in an agency that is critical to this nation, in my judgment.
Mr. Chairman, I would also argue that the state EPAs have authority on this issue too, so to regulate this on the use.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Does any other member seek time? I'd like to add, I know you're a farmer. A couple of years ago, 6 or 8 years ago, I had an opportunity in the middle of a drought in Texas. I came to Ohio.
Yep.
And south and east of you, I had never seen so much water in my life in just a normal lake and a river that was full. Then I showed up, and you had, as I recall, corn to the sky when we were burned up all over everywhere else I went.
Yes, I think, too, if I recall, when you left, we had about 3 inches of rain that night, and we had problems.
Well, you know, we'd have taken it from you, but I do, in fact, appreciate and respect your leadership on this issue with firsthand knowledge not only of the men and women who live off the topsoil of this country, but who provide food to our tables, and we're grateful for it, and we appreciate it. Seeing now that no other member has questions, we want to thank you very much, not only for your feedback, but moving the bill to Rules Committee. Thank you very much. Appreciate it,
Thank you, Mr.
gentlemen.
Chairman.
If you'll please leave whatever you brought for our stenographer so that she has that in writing, it sure helps her out. I know she's good at that. Great. Thank you very much. Before we go too much further, I want to acknowledge that there's a group of women who I met actually the other night in the Capitol. They're from the University of Houston. They are young women who were with former member Jack Fields. And Jack, I know they're not here to give testimony, but as I recall, they were here with the World Food Program and learning in Washington as a summer intern program. I'm not going to get these names right, but I'm going to try my best. So ladies, if you'll please let me know, I will put your names to our awesome stenographer. Pooja Jabhavla, I told you I didn't get it right. Katie Drews, Eden Azar, Melina Diaz, Livia Garza, Rogeta Saba, and Marifta Kata. Now, do you want to try those yourself?
I don't think I could pass on.
All right, so with that said, would these young women actually understand that the Rules Committee is a laboratory for the things that help Congress? And I took a few minutes with them and invited them actually to come up, Louise, and to be here with us. So I know these young women are learning about.
Tell me what they're doing out there. Is it a summer program?
Interns at the
Okay,
Smithsonian.
for food.
No, we're all at different museums, actually.
Okay,
Oh,
well, I got
okay.
it wrong, but that's what I heard.
Well, good for you. Glad to
Yeah.
have you. We like that.
And
We
they were-
approve of women doing a lot of good
Well,
important work.
we not only that, but we took time.
I know
to
Lynn
explain
Cheney
some
would say
things.
that if she were here.
Lynn was here just a minute ago.
Okay.
Today, I had an opportunity to meet the head of the Arboretum here, and he came to my office this morning. We had a chance to talk. He's a botanist, and we talked about exactly the same things that we were engaged in here, the bees and other things, and I took time with him, and I learned a lot, too. So these young women that have taken time to wander up here, Louise, afterwards, if you would, we'd love to get you in the office and get their picture with
Sure.
you. If you would.
Can we do that?
Sure. I promised them if they come, they could see you. Okay,
Great
so
attached.
I've butchered up their names. We'll make sure we get that, stenographer, she'll get that right. Chairman, now I'm being received a motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 9553, the Reducing Regulatory Burdens Act of 2017, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order its original text for the purpose of amendment, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-21, and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes an order only those further amendments printed in the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instruction.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. For the ladies that are here, we held a hearing today. We went through a process where we allowed questions to be taking place. We then closed the hearing. We then are moving what we consider to be what's called the rule and what the rules are related to that. And now we open that up to amendment or discussion, gentlewoman.
And Mr. Chairman, I do have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee grant H.R. 953 an open rule so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bill on the floor.
Thank you very much. Discussion? Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I certainly support the rule, amendment to the rule that Ms. Slaughter offers, and I also want to reiterate the concerns expressed by my colleague, Mr. McGovern, earlier. I imagine a day will come that we will have some significant hearings in the various committees of jurisdiction, but it isn't happening fast enough. And somewhere along the lines, I'm of a mind that we are doing ourselves, not just in the Rules Committee, but in the institution, a terrible disservice by not hearing from people who have sometimes distinctly different views and sometimes in alignment on matters of consequence here that we legislate on. So I guess that's summed up under the need to return to regular order and to stop just talking about it. But here we are again with something that did not have hearings in one of the committees of jurisdiction and did not even have a markup in one as well. And to me, that augurs poorly for the institution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Further discussion? Vote will now be on the Slaughter amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
Roll call.
Noes have it. Gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? No. Mr. Buck, no. Ms. Cheney? Oh, Ms. Slaughter?
Aye.
Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman,
Clerk
no.
report the total.
3 yeas. 7 nays.
Amendment's not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? See none, the vote will now be on the motion for the gentleman, young chairman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the
we have a
gentleman,
roll call?
gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Slaughter?
No.
Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern? No. Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman? Aye.
Clerk report the total.
7 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. As agreed to, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, will be handling this for Republicans.
Mr. McGovern from
Mr.
Massachusetts.
McGovern will be handling this for Democrats, as he promised.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentlemen,
Yeah, if I could just be recognized for a minute.
Gentleman's recognized.
So I don't know how many of my colleagues read the interesting article that appeared in Bloomberg over the last week by Billy House entitled, "House May Need to Vote Again on the GOP Obamacare Repeal Bill." And for those who didn't see it, I mean, apparently, even though the majority felt the need to rush the bill through the Rules Committee into the floor under emergency procedures with barely any time to read the legislation, it's been sitting here for more than 2 weeks while we wait for a CBO score. And I'm not sure whether your members realize that there was absolutely no need for them to take that vote without having without knowing the full impact of that bill. And I guess, from what I understand, it is still possible that we will consider the bill up here in the Rules Committee again and vote on it again on the floor, as the article suggests, because, again, the Republican leadership forced members to vote before a CBO score was even available. So I don't know, I pointed out, and I'm not quite sure what else to say, Mr. Chairman, because this process has truly been a disaster from start, well, not to finish, since we're apparently possibly not done yet. But it goes back to my point on the previous legislation. I think we have to insist on both sides of the aisle that we pay closer attention to proper process, because you know, I mean, I think if we end up having to do this again, I think it's kind of embarrassing. I think the bill's a disaster. I would like it to die. But it just points out that process, when you ignore it, sometimes causes complications. But I just point that out in case my colleagues haven't seen the piece. So with that, I thank the chairman. I yield back.
I think
Quoted in that, saying that every school child knows.
gentlewoman's recognized.
Every school child knows that once the House passes a bill, it goes to the Senate, and then reconciliation then becomes law. But there was nothing about keeping it in the drawer for a couple of weeks. You get some information you should have had before you passed it the first time. Do you agree?
No, I agree. I guess the point we tried to make before the consideration was that we should wait for a CBO score, and apparently we now have to wait for a CBO score before you can send it over to the Senate. And it's possible, based on what we learned, that you might have to take it up again here in committee. So,
It's taking an inordinate long time to get a CBO score.
Well, I want to be forthright.
Yeah.
I think they need to take the time they need to get what they need done.
Do you think we should have voted on it before we had that?
Well, no, that's a good question.
Yeah.
The answer is that I believe that the amendments that were made there too had a dollar amount that specified the amount of money that would be added. Now, the corresponding policy that came out of that sometimes is right or wrong, but the money was well understood. I think the money was, for my questions, the money was understood. And then we'll find out what they say. You know, we don't know
Well,
yet.
no, but I can't imagine.
When we
they had to
find
send
out-
help from Great Britain or something to
Well, when
to
we
score
find
that.
out, yeah, it's a good question, Jimmy.
I mean,
I think it's fair. I'm saying, when we find out the policy, then I'll find out.
You don't have any reason to give us as to why they have not been able to get the CBO score in a
Well,
matter of weeks.
nor am I taking advantage of them.
Okay.
I think they've taken the time, they're trying to do it right, and I applaud them for
They're
it.
trying to make a silk purse, aren't they?
No, I think what they're trying to do is to make sure, because we
Yeah.
we've put a lot of pressure on them. We do.
Okay.
Well, you agree, I mean, sometimes they're our friend and sometimes they're not our
Yeah.
friend. I think dealing fairly, I have,
I just don't recall, do you all recall it? Maybe it's just me, but I don't recall waiting that long.
well, maybe
For a
that might be a
CBO
good
score.
argument. That might be a good argument. I had not
Yeah,
derived
it
that.
seems a long time to me.
Good.
Okay.
Okay, let's
Any
see.
more meetings this week?
The answer to that is, we have announced a meeting for tomorrow at 3 o'clock on HR 1761, the Protecting Against Child Exploitation Act of 2017, and H.R. 1973, the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act of
There'll probably be
2017.
one rule for two bills? Is that what we're planning?
Probably will
Okay,
be. We're
okay.
now into the week, and we're doing that. Now, if I could, not as response, but I realize I need to start doing this because we're interested in this. I've got a list of the hearings that are taking place that have been announced this week. Rules Committee is not listed in this, but it's the House committees that are holding hearings, and there are an incredible number of hearings. Never should I get the point or take it that anything that comes up here needs a hearing behind it too. I do agree with that, but I just wanted to, so without
How
objection. I'll
come they
be on
left
that.
us off?
Well,
We're a committee of the House.
yeah, I did not,
I don't appreciate that.
well, then I'll, I mean, I think we report that we're gonna do it. This was, maybe we
That's right,
said,
ours are all emergency, aren't they?
so.
Nobody knows that. Okay, gotcha. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's attention. By the way, for the young women that are here, our new awesome stenographers, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we're going to get these young women in there. Thank you very much. This completes the committee work for the day.